Hey everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Tech Bytes Takeover, or as I fondly love to call it, Between Two Geese. I am Tyler Jurgens. Along with me is Matt Crape. Matt, why don't you introduce us a little bit of what we're talking about today?
Absolutely. Thanks for the introduction there, Tyler. We are thrilled to be back again. For those of you who might be tuning in for the first time, feel free to drop a hi into chat. We love to make this interactive. But let's get to what we're talking about today. So, there's been a lot of talk about hypervisor migration. We heard from a lot of our peers who were recently at HPE Discover that there were lots of questions there. I'm hearing about other hypervisors as well. So we're here to talk all about hypervisor migration today. So we're going to talk about three separate hypervisor migrations that you can perform today. We're going to walk through those. We're going to give you two post-migration tips to make sure that you stay resilient after the fact, as well as one tip to make sure that you set up for success when it comes to your workload migration, with one piece of future planning for your upgrades that might be around the corner as well. Ideally, leaving you with zero regrets with tuning in. So there's a lot that we're going to be covering here. Tyler, why don't you kick us off here? Like, what are your thoughts on how we approach this topic?
Oh, Matt, we got so much to cover, and I didn't want to just show one hypervisor today. I didn't want to just show like, hey, you can migrate one direction. We got so many different hypervisors in our lab here, and I got to remind everyone here, this is our lab, and we are doing this live. So I am hopeful that we don't run into any lab gremlins along the way because we do some weird things in here to try to get things, working a little differently. So we're going to show you a few hypervisor migrations. We're going to show you a bit of, moving to Nutanix or Hyper-V, and we're going to actually walk through the HPE VME migration live right here. Haven't even tested it, Matt. Let's hope it works, right? But before we get started, Matt, there's always a few things we want to show, and like Matt said, drop us a honk. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and what hypervisors you are looking at to migrate either in your home lab or in your work environment. We had this conversation, Matt and I and a few of our friends on, what are we doing in our home labs these days, right? What are we moving to? I've been, deploying a bit of a K3 cluster for a few of my Docker containers. I've been running through a bit of, different hypervisors themselves. So, Matt, what are you looking at in your home lab these days? Well, I find this report here to pull up.
Absolutely. So yeah, I'm still running some VMware in there. It's tried, trusted, and true. I've got a lot of NAS stuff I back up as well. So obviously I'm using Veeam Data Platform for that. But I've also started tinkering around with a lot of Proxmox stuff. It's pretty good drop-in replacement, especially from the home lab perspective. There's a lot that you could do there. And as Tyler and I were kind of talking about what we're doing, this is kind of where the topic came up. If we're still talking about it and we hear from folks in the field, they still have lots of questions around this. We thought, you know what? Let's go back, let's revisit this again, but let's kind of dedicate a bit of a longer segment to this. So we've touched on the various hypervisors in the past, but let's approach this more almost from a workshop style. What does good successful migration look like from a hypervisor perspective? But before we even dive into that, Tyler, why would you want to use your backups to migrate?
Oh, great question, Matt. So I like using the backups to migrate because then you're not necessarily impacting your production VMs right off the bat. You can do a migration, you can do a recovery to a different hypervisor, to the same hypervisor, to the cloud, wherever you're looking to go. You can do that without impacting your production and then try it again, right? Maybe you're, looking to migrate to, Proxmox or Nutanix or HPE or all three, and you're just testing it out. You can grab your backup, same backup file, recover them to all three hypervisors, and see which one you like best, which one is doing what you need for your business. So I love doing that with the backup files themselves and just running through that. Matt, did I miss anything there? You're asking a very pointed question.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I like as well. I love your point about it not affecting production, right? So maybe you're doing some sort of cutover plan, or maybe it's a matter of just powering off the VM in one spot and you're storing it somewhere else. But what I really like about that is it gives you your failback plan. If something doesn't quite go right, but at the same time, it also makes it very, very easy to test these things out. You could do it with very little commitment. You could perform a restore, and hey, if things don't work out on this hypervisor after you've been trying out for a while, maybe you'll switch to somewhere else. Now, one of the great things here is, this is also a good opportunity to, when you're assessing different hypervisors. And just before we dive into this report here, where we're going to talk about this, I want to give a quick shout out to a couple of folks who are chiming in here, both on LinkedIn as well as on YouTube. So, hi, Mehmet, great to hear from you. And it looks like we're also getting some comments here from Todd. So, absolutely keep them coming. Now, where it's going with this is, this is going to be a change of the platform. So it's a good time to reassess. Maybe things are over proficient. Maybe they're under proficient. So Tyler, why don't you walk us through how we can actually take this opportunity here?
Yeah, absolutely. Great statement there, Matt. And like really, like you said, maybe you have some oversized VMs, some undersized VMs. Things are just not, necessarily ever looked at after you deploy them too often. So now's a good chance. Let's jump into your Veeam one and let's take a look at some of the reports and see what our infrastructure is doing and see if there's an opportunity here to right size the VMs as we're moving across. It's always a great opportunity if you're switching hypervisors. You might be getting some new hardware in there. You might have, tighter restrictions around stuff like RAM. RAM prices these days are not as inexpensive as they used to be. So jumping through this and taking a look at your oversized VMs is a great way to be able to resize, right? Maybe you just don't need all that compute that you had originally, right? So I like to do that initially, get a bit of a baseline, see where my VMs are at. And then after, before I'm doing any kind of migration, I'm going to jump into my Veeam backup replication. I'm going to take a look at my backups themselves and see if my backup history is, successful, if I've got any failures, if I've got any warnings, if I've got any challenges with some of the VMs that I am looking to migrate. So here I'm going to attempt to zoom in here, something Matt likes me to do. Oh, it worked today. That is wonderful. I'm pumped. So you can see here, we're going to be doing some of these green zone DBs that we've got here. They're currently on a VMware backup, and we last ran a backup about an hour ago. So we can jump in here, see where the success is. We're happy to see everything is moving pretty quick. And, we could run a new backup if we want right before we do the migration, which is always a good plan to do. Get your baseline. How long are your backups running? How long do they need to run? And then when you're looking to do that final migration, you have a good baseline to know, okay, I'm going to start my migration now. Can I, do a backup? Do I need to do a scan? Do I need to do any kind of recovery like that to make sure my backups are clean? And you can go through the history here. I like this little hidden feature within Veeam where you just hit the left and right arrows when you bring up a backup session and you can see the previous session. So as you can see, I'm going through here. I'm looking at the different backup jobs as they go, and you can see the duration changes there. So we can see different things here to give us a good baseline on how long this job is expected to take when we want to do that final backup. Matt, is there anything you want to show here?
I want to give a quick shout out to the audience here, and I love the spread of hypervisors that we're hearing about. So we've heard Proxmox a couple of times, definitely some HPE VME love going on out there. We've got Nutanix coming up. So if anything, this really kind of paints the picture of you need that versatility, right? And one of the challenges, especially with switching platforms as it relates to data resilience, is what do you do with everything that's existing, right? You have all those backups, years worth of backups. You still need to be able to maintain them somehow, whether it's a matter of pulling files out, whether it's for compliance. And that's really one of the beauties that we have here at Veeam Data Platform, right? The fact that you can just kind of keep moving things around and still retain access to the old data that you might have. So keep those comments coming. We love hearing what folks, are using, what they see, what they would like to see. So absolutely. Now, Tyler, I noticed that you were bringing up the scan backup here. So why is that? Why would you be doing this? What's your thought process here?
Absolutely. So I like to do the scan backup. And, as I was alluding to a little earlier, you want to make sure that your backups are clean. So let's say you're concerned, you know, if you have any kind of, malware infection, any kind of issue with your restore points themselves, you can find the latest clean restore point. Maybe you're doing a migration. Maybe you're doing a forced migration because you were hit by something and you need to move to a different hypervisor in the process. You can find the latest clean restore point, scan it with Threat Hunter, scan it for different YARA rules. Maybe you got some PII you need to eliminate. Maybe you're crossing geos, right? Going to a different environment, and you need to make sure that you're not moving some of your data that is sovereign in that geo outside of that location. So there's a lot of opportunity here to check your backups for any of that kind of stuff. So I'm having trouble driving and talking at the same time, Matt. I can only do one thing. So yeah, like I like to do that. And as we go through here, Matt, like we've done a couple instant recoveries. Why don't you talk through a little bit about what we could see there?
Absolutely. And well, once again, another shout out to the audience here. Even more hypervisors being mentioned, Virtuoso, Verge. I know those are two very popular requests, so for folks who maybe frequent the R&D forums, as you probably know, you could go in there, you can make requests. R&D does take a look at those, and that's always a great source for information. So, go there, pipe in those comments, see if there's a thread existing already. There might already be some information there. Now, Tyler, I see that you've brought up a recovery screen here, and kind of looks like we have some results here. So why don't you walk us through what we're seeing here line by line?
Right, so I want to do a bit of an instant VM recovery. So we got a few different options when you're moving workloads from one platform to another. You can do either an instant VM recovery or a full VM restore. When I was doing the instant VM recovery, Matt and I both looked, it's like, hey, you can run some YARA rules right there during the restore. So we set some of that off. And you can see we have, a rule match here for one of our YARA rules. So something to dig in a little more. I actually wasn't expecting to see this show up as a result, and here we go. So, if it's kind of creeping up on me in my lab, it very possibly is creeping up for you in your production environment. So, take a look through. This is an instant recovery we have here to Hyper-V, and it's just waiting for us to go through and promote to production. We got another instant recovery here to Nutanix that is again just waiting for production. I didn't run a Yara scan on it. It is just sitting there waiting for us. But Matt, why don't you talk? What other recovery options do you have? I'll bring it up on screen. You talk it through.
Absolutely. So there's a few things let's touch on here. So we've got the Yara scan, and you kind of mentioned it, right? Maybe you need search for, threats, known threats, but you can also use that to search for personally identifiable information. That could be really important when you're planning out your migration if you happen to be dealing with, any sort of regulations. Think maybe GDPR, NIS2, anything like that. You can actually use YARA rules to look for these types of things as well. So chances are, if you're migrating hypervisors, you might be sticking to the same data center. But if you happen to be changing geos or something like that, keep that in mind as well. You can actually look for information as part of this. Now, the other thing that we need to kind of at least acknowledge as part of that transition between hypervisors, and we'll probably circle back to this as well, is think about things that you need to do beforehand, before you get to the new destination. Things like OS drivers for things like networking and so forth. If you're coming from, let's say, VMware tools and going somewhere else, you might need to do a little bit of a driver swap. But we'll circle back to that shortly. So Tyler, you've got the instant recovery options up here. If you're new to Veeam, this is probably one of the biggest features that you should be aware of, is being able to get your backups back up and running really, really quickly across many different platforms. One of the newest additions to this list is actually Microsoft Azure. So yes, you can perform an instant recovery to Azure, which is super, super handy for getting things back up and running quickly because you may not have the resources available locally, or B, maybe you just need like a clean room, something, to perform, whether it's that scan, something to restore, maybe test dev, somewhere sandboxed. You could do that as well. Now, we've also got a host of other options available here when it comes to a full VM recovery. Now, Tyler, I think you said that you actually want to walk through the HP Morpheus VM Essentials recovery, right?
Absolutely, I do. So let me find my backups that I am going to restore to HPE. Let's see if I can do it all through the Zoom It session because that's going to be interesting right here. So we can see we've got a few listed here, and you might be saying to yourself, but Matt, Tyler, I'm not seeing all the hypervisors you support. Well, that is because we don't have all the plugins installed in our Veeam software appliance lab environment here. We've been working through to build out the lab a little more, but we just don't have everything there quite yet. But we do have, this isn't the full exhaustive list of all the hypervisors we support, and there are more coming soon, Matt. With our next release, we're going to see another, I think last time I counted, what was it, 4 or 6 more hypervisors? It's going to be incredible. So why don't we walk through the restore here? I lost it on my screen because I was zoomed in. Let's see if I can zoom back in.
There you
Okay,
go. You found it.
I found it, Matt. I found it. Give us a honk if you have done this before. If you have gone through these restore options, if you have tried to recover to, different hypervisors, and what are the challenges? What are some of the tips you have for anybody here that might be needing to do this at home or do this at work, right? So let's pick our clusters. We got our HPE Morpheus VM Essential server. We've got our lab environment here. We're going to click OK without zooming right off the screen. I have found the OK button. And, we're going to click Next. This is where we're going to want to pick our data store. So this is going to pull any of the data stores that you have in your lab environment or in your destination hypervisor itself. We're going to walk through a bit of that. Select Next. We want to select the new VM name. Let's select a name that makes sense to us. We're going to give it a bit of a suffix here.
Now, something just while you're typing that, in the other window, once you hit OK there, I want to give a shout out to that restored tags and labels. Why is that important? Well, especially in larger environments, you might be tagging or creating labels for these VMs. Maybe it's based on workload, maybe it's based on backup priority. So keep that in mind. You may not be able to necessarily always create new backup jobs based on those tags. So for example, in VMware, you could create backup jobs based on categories, which automatically picks up VMs. But that might still be good metadata information that you might need restored if you're going somewhere else that supports that. So very useful little checkbox to have as well. So Tyler, I see you're in here, you're going through, you're configuring the network. I mean, another great shout out here is you can also restore this in a disconnected state. So why would you want to do that? Maybe you're testing. Maybe you want to make sure that it's more or less in a quarantine environment. Maybe this is kind of an emergency migration because you've been hit with something like ransomware and you want to restore this closed off somewhere, performing that YARA scan that we talked about to make sure that it's clean. Lots of different use cases for when you might want that. And as Tyler mentioned, make sure that, hey, you know what? If you've got your own tips or questions along the way, drop them into chat and we'll do our best to answer them. So I see Dinesh has a question about how can I recover the deleted files? So if we're talking about file level recovery, that's absolutely possible. There's many different ways to be able to do that. Just while you've got that recovery kicked off, Tyler, why don't you just show us, quickly, maybe on one of these backups, what does a file level recovery look like? I know it's a little bit outside the scope, but hey, you know what? Folks are asking questions. Let's do our best to answer.
Absolutely, Matt. No, great call out there. So we can do a couple different things. You could actually restore the VM files. Now, this isn't going to get you to the granular level of file, like somebody's Excel file, but maybe you have a entire VM disk that was deleted. You can recover that with the VM files here itself. Or you recover the guest files themselves. So you find the restore point that you believe you have that right file in, and then you can walk through the wizard here. It's going to open up that recovery explorer there, the file explorer. I don't want to do that. It's going to get us a little off track here, but that's essentially what you do. You go here and then you can browse through the files themselves of that recovery of that restore point you have and keep looking. And Matt, I know you were a big fan of Enterprise Manager. There's ways there. I don't have it up on our screen right now, but there's ways there to search for those deleted files within your backups themselves. So, great question there from Danish.
Yeah, absolutely. And just touch on Enterprise Manager. You can also do the guest indexing in there. So you may not know where that file actually is, but as part of the backup job, we can actually index the whole, disk, and then you just search for the file name. And in Enterprise Manager, you could go through, it'll search through all the indexes and actually find where that file is for you, and you can perform that recovery from there. So lots and lots of ways that we can actually recover that file. We could probably do a whole episode on that, along with application object recovery and so forth and so forth. But let's get back to things here. So you've kicked off, the recoveries and all that. How are things looking here?
Well, Matt, I think we have a challenge in our lab here. My HP VM didn't recover, but I'm going to jump over here to the Nutanix, which of course timed me out just as I wanted to jump in to take a look at that. So, like I said, this is a lab.
Yep.
It is not necessarily going to work exactly how we were hoping it to from day one, but you can see our instant recoveries here. Let me pull up my VMs. So you can see the instant recovery here I have on this Linux server is right here. It's got that same tag that we had before. So you can see it is there. I did restore it without a network connection there just to make sure that we aren't duplicating anything there. And, a shout out to what Matt was saying earlier about the tag. So one thing that is critically important there when you are recovering those tags is to make sure that you are, it gives you that benefit of your next resilience, right? So you've restored to a tag. Now you can have a tag job already pre-made in your VBR to look for any VMs, any workloads that land within that tag, and then it'll immediately start backing them up once you recover into that destination hypervisor. So, we've got this here. Let me jump over. We can show our Hyper-V VM as well. We've got that guy here. I restored him powered off. So you see there's a few different options there. You can restore fully powering on the VM. You can restore with the VM powered off and the rest of it there. And, we could take a look and do some live troubleshooting on that HPE job, but I don't think we're going to do that today, Matt. We had some other topics we wanted to talk about as well. What else do you want to chat about here?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mentioned earlier the R&D forums, right? Great place to go find out what's new, what's coming, a little bit of sneak peek. So we touched on this a little bit earlier, and I know there's more than a couple of folks, a lot of folks actually, based on the comments watching who use Proxmox. The eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed a nice little tidbit of knowledge that was dropped into the R&D forums lately about what's coming for Proxmox. And that's actually going to include support for instant VM recovery as well as replication. So those are two very big features that have been asked for. We'll be seeing those as part of 13.1, which is going to be coming, soon. I can't say when, but soon. So start, thinking about what that means for your environment. Now, the other thing that we kind of just touched on briefly was the whole drivers, making sure that you have the right drivers when you're doing this migration. I can't go into too much detail about that right now, but expect that experience to look a lot better once again in 13.1. You might be able to find some more details in the forums, but it's really about making sure that data portability story that we tell, that data mobility, being able to move your VMs wherever you need to move them, it's going to get even more seamless. So lots of great stuff coming along there. So Tyler, we've done migrations. Hopefully folks have been able to follow along. Lots of different options where you could go to. You can take one backup, restore to multiple hypervisors. Let's say you've finally decided on, hey, I'm going to land on hypervisor XYZ. Cool. Everything's going good. We talked about having some baselines before, right? Ensuring that you understand how long does it take maybe a VM to boot up, a system to boot up? How long does it take for a backup to run? These are important because when you land on the new system, you want to be able to sort of measure that performance, right? Are things good? Do things land as expected? But then there's also a big step that a lot of folks may miss, and that comes down to, are you actually protecting those new VMs on their new home? You don't want them to fall through the cracks. So, Tyler, why don't we jump a little bit into that? What can folks do to ensure that, hey, they're not missing any new, well, not new workloads, but workloads in their new homes?
Absolutely. Like I said, we can do those tags. I like that idea of tagging. I've really become fond of that over the years of, in your VMware backups or any of the systems that support tagging, create a tag for the different kind of jobs. And then when you're migrating, when you're doing those with the tags, you create a backup job based off the tag and away you go. And you can see here, our I believe our Nutanix job in here, wherever it is actually based off Nutanix categories. So, one of those things that you can continue to do. And there are a few different Veeam One reports you can get into as well. So you can take a look at your VMs, your protected computers for backup for agent-based backups or protected VMs for workloads. And what you'd want to do there is take a look at what you've got going on for your protected VMs, and then take a look at what you have after you're doing your migrations and making sure things don't really shift or move around on you so you're not losing out on some of these backups that you had previously, right? You're going to want to make sure they continue through. And then we had, let's say we're doing Proxmox here. Let me just kind of wing it a bit here. Find the Proxmox reports and find, the protected VMs on your KVM environment. So you could do, your protected VMs on your VMware environment and then compare it here to your protected VMs on your KVM environment and making sure they match up after the fact.
So while you're taking a breather there, I do want to address a question that came in about, when is Veeam Backup Replication going to support HPE VME 9.0? Well, the good news is, and we should be able to get the link shared here shortly, is we support that today. We support from 8.0.13-2 up to 9.0. So you've got that protection today. So we're on the ball with that. And hopefully that answers the question for you. Now, Tyler, sorry, I distracted you a little bit here from the talk track. So what's next?
You are more than welcome to distract me any day you want, Matt. But I think we want to talk a little bit about, planning for that 13.1 upgrade. What comes next? What are you going to want to do? And great news, if you're already on that Veeam software appliance, you are set and ready to go to upgrade to 13.1 whenever it releases. It is coming soon. But I think for that, you are good to go, right? It's going to be scheduled. You can have it scheduled. We've talked about Veeam Updater plenty of times in the past, and man, I could talk about it for the next half an hour, but we don't have that kind of time, Matt. So, I think there is a few tips here in this KB article, and we'll have that shared out in the chat soon too. So you can see where you can jump from and to here. And it's 13.1 is going to come out with a bunch of great, releases here, great new features. In 13.02, we've got a lot of bug fixes. So if you're not up there yet, I suggest you take a look and see where you can go. If you're on the Veeam software appliance, you're probably already on 13.02 because it takes care of that kind of work for you. You just don't have to stress about it. But Matt, we also want to talk about, migrating from Windows to Linux. You had a few points you wanted to make there.
Yeah, absolutely. And just while we're still on this page here, a couple of things to note. This is KB2053. We'll try to get that link shared out. And it will be updated once 13.1 comes out. So, if you're on an older version like 11, you'll see that's going to be updated, right? Or similarly, like Tyler mentioned, if you're on the latest and greatest, hey, it's going to be a fairly straightforward path. All the better if you're on the Veeam software appliance, because that Veeam updater does magical things. Now, Veeam software appliance, you mentioned that whole conversion process. So folks who have been around, using it for a while, they might be aware of this. We've got this sign up page. What can you, do on this page? Well, you can express interest in, hey, I want to actually be able to convert from my Windows-based installation over to the Veeam software appliance. So as it is in product today, it's not, just a one and done process, but rather there's actually quite a few steps that need to be involved. And that's why we took this approach of sign up, we'll get support looped in, we'll get PM looped in, and we're doing it very much on a bit of a basis going, through each customer batch at a time. So that's very much well underway. We've had customers who have already done the conversion. Things are going good. But there's also, something else that you need to be aware of, which is this next KB article, KB 4800. So what is this? This is very, very important to read if you are planning or interested in going from the Windows-based installation to the Veeam software appliance, which is Linux-based. So Tyler, if you zoom in a little bit there's probably some good details that we need to go through. So you've got the usual, what's the purpose of this? What do you need to know before you begin? So these are very important things. Any of these, if you don't satisfy them, it's a little bit of a non-starter to some degree, right? So you need to have basically Veeam Universal License. You need to make sure that you're running everything, that you've got an active support contract. And I think the one that trips up most of the support cases is that receive proactive support. That needs to be enabled in order for us to help you with this conversion process. Why is this? Because that provides a lot of the telemetry that helps us figure out, is this or is this not a suitable upgrade? So what do I mean by that? A little bit further down in that KB, you'll see that we've got this limitations section. So that telemetry will tell us, are there things within here that will have limitations that might prevent you from actually going to 13.1. Tyler, I know you're a big Cloud Connect guy, so that one probably stands out to you a little bit, but you need to make sure that you go through and you read all these things and say, do any of these apply to me? Storage plugins might be a big one for some environments. Not all of the plugins are actually available on the Veeam software appliance today. Of course, we're making great strides going forward with that. So lots of information here, and maybe Tyler, if you zoom out a little bit, we'll give folks a good idea of what actually this page looks like. There's a wealth of information, but this is very much a matter of, yeah, it might be tedious to go through, but there's a reason why it's there. If you're going down this path, we want to ensure that it is as smooth as possible and that you see success. Now, part of the reason why we're bringing this up now is also to advise folks that, we'll see this reflected on that VSA signup page that was shared as well. When 13.1 comes out, this process won't be applicable at that point. It will still work absolutely fine on the 13.0 patch train, so 13.02 as it stands today. That will still be supported as far as actually performing the migration over to the Veeam software appliance. But at least initially, if you move to 13.1, it will not be supported. Part of the reason for that is there's a lot of new features. There's some small architectural changes. As with anything, when a new version comes out, there's a lot of testing that needs to be done. So I'm throwing that out there as a little bit of a public service announcement in the sense of, if you're on the list, if you're planning on converting to VSA, if you basically find that you meet all the criteria, make sure that you go ahead today and fill out this form, get on the list, open up a support case, and you're good to go. But if you find that maybe, hey, you know what, the Windows-based install is actually still working fine for me, or maybe it's also a matter of there's some limitations on there that we can't live without, 13.1 will still work fine with, with Veeam backup and replication. So no problems there. So a lot of information. We've been trying to share a lot of great links here. If there are of interest, absolutely go through there, read them, understand them, and if you have any questions about them, we're always happy to try to field some of these questions live. So with that, Tyler, we've been talking for about 34 minutes now. So it's been a long one. So we're going to get this wrapped up before we're cut off here. Any closing thoughts, my good friend?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. You'd hit the nail on the head a lot with that conversion process from the Windows to the Linux Veeam software appliance. And one thing I want to point out, and it's a bit of a myth buster, is that you can't see all the features that you had with the Windows VBR on the Linux Veeam software appliance, but you can. And a lot of people run into that because they open the web UI and they don't see every hypervisor listed, but they are all there. You just have to use that Windows console to get to them. And that is, we're making heavy strides into improving that web UI experience. So, the coming the coming releases are that are pending are going to have a lot more of those hypervisors available for you within that web UI. But then I'll leave us with this closing thought here. We have this post here from Veeam Software. We're talking about what is your go-to advice for people as they're starting out with Veeam on day one. We got this Veeam first 100 days with the Veeam Data Platform. I know, Matt, this was a very near and dear project to your heart. What do we want to leave people with this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of spun off from a session that myself and the fellow Veeamer Brad Barker did for a few years at VeeamON. Didn't do anything this past VeeamON, but in the past we've kind of architected it as, say you're net new to Veeam Data Platform. What should you be doing and when? What does that look like? So this isn't meant to be a hard and fast first 100 days, but rather it's a matter of, what order should you think about doing things in? Don't start with the most complex stuff first, but rather make sure you get a solid foundation built up. So part of the reason why we're sharing this is it ties in great to what we're talking about today as far as best practices. And there's a great LinkedIn post here where, we're asking as a company, hey, if you've got some great tips to share, post them on here, share it with the wider community, and let's spread that knowledge out.
Absolutely, Matt. So, with that, I think we are all out of time for today. We've got our producers are not going to let us talk too much longer. They're just going to mute us eventually here and, silence all the honking. But if you do want to hear more from us, if you want to see more of a specific situation we've shown today or something else, we had that great question about file level recovery that I didn't get too deep into. If you want to see more of that, give us a shout out here. We're available on LinkedIn. Drop a comment on this channel. We're going to have our next episode coming up in August, man, and that's going to be a great episode. So I'm looking forward to that one. So yeah, come follow along, check us out on socials, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.